If Finland was an adjective, what would be its definition? Would it be for a modern context or historical context? Well, I'd say that for a country to be Finland, it would have to tick these three criteria. For box 1, first and foremost, it'll have to be a stable democracy. This is pretty much the third box from the first episode of the series, which was about Switzerland, as the same is applicable for Finland as well, because Finland constantly ranks as one of the happiest and freest countries in the whole world. So whether you agree with it or not, it should come as no surprise that this will be the first criteria. Moving on from a modern perception of Finland, let's mention a famous historical one. For box 2, I've made it be having fended off a major power. A lot of Finns mention the Winter War as a point of pride, since they were, at least supposed to be, major underdogs against the Soviet army. However, this was not the case, having successfully prevented the Soviet Union from annexing Finland. Finland also famously fended off the Nazis in the Lapland War, if you want to use that as an example too. But either way, let's move on to box 3, which will be distinct/unique from its region. This is in reference to the fact that Finland is ethnically and linguistically distinct from not just the whole Nordic region, but Europe as a whole. Since they are part of the Finno-Ugric family, also sometimes called the Uralic family, with its namesake origins hailing from the Ural Mountains roughly 2,000 to 1,500 years ago, making Finland one of the few countries in Europe to have a majority demographic with non-Indo-European origins. Alright, now that I've covered my three criteria, let's hit it with the first entry. The Americas, Canada. For box 1, Canada ticks this box pretty comfortably, despite some of its flaws coming to light. Canada is always one of the usual suspects that ranks highly in international indexes like human development, economic freedom, quality of life, global peace, and many others. Just like how Finland ranks highly in those kind of lists too. Moving on to box 2 is where the history lesson comes in. Now, Canada is technically under the British Crown. So how can I tick this box knowing this fact? Well, that's because I'm not using the British as my example, and instead the power that they fended off is none other than the United States. During the War of 1812, the US was on the hunt for more territory, and after the Louisiana Purchase from France, who wanted the money to conquer all of Europe, got the British Navy real heated, as they were doing their best to try and fend off Napoleon's military over in Europe. And as the saying goes, desperate times calls for desperate measures, and the desperate measure was the impressment of American sailors. If you don't know what that means, it's basically when you invade a ship and force that crew to join your cause. And in this case, that cause was the Napoleonic Wars, which I alluded to earlier. As you can imagine, this is not something that the Americans appreciated, which led to the US's first declaration of war on a foreign entity. So when does Canada come into the picture? Well, since Canada was a British colony, the US Army started leading their troops towards the Canadian border at Fort Detroit. However, due to a lack of confidence and experience under the American General William Hull, surrendered against the army from Canada. And in 1814, the Treaty of Ghent was made, which resulted in the status quo antebellum, meaning the borders go back to what they were before the war. And crucially for this context, that meant no loss of territory for Canada. So considering the British failed to defeat the Americans in 1776, Canada having their territory remain intact was virtually a victory for the Canadians. So I consider this a pretty solid tick for box 2. And for box 3, I suppose what makes Canada distinct from the rest of the Americas would be the Inuit, aka Eskimo population, as Canada has the most in the Americas, as well as the whole world. And the reason this is distinct is because the Inuits, or more broadly the Eskimo Aleut population, represent the last wave of migration from Siberia through the Bering Strait. And interestingly, the Inuits and the Finns have a somewhat recent common ancestor. However, that theory is contested and hasn't really been confirmed, but I figured it would be worth a mention. But with that being said, in my books, box 3 is a tick, and let's move on to the next entry. Oceania, New Zealand. Similarly to Canada, New Zealand is one of the usual suspects that appears on the lists that you want to appear on as a country. And I'll show some on screen, but I think you get the idea. So that's already a tick. Now for box 2, New Zealand's case is interesting. The Flagstaff War, also known as the Northern War, happened in the mid-19th century when the tensions between the British Crown and the Maori chiefs became too much to settle with. As it should come as no surprise, the British Empire were wanting to expand their territory upwards to the North Island of New Zealand, clashing with the Maori tribes who wanted to keep the relationship with the British as merely with trade and nothing further. The conflict centered around the flagstaff atop Maiki Hill in modern-day Russell, which the British considered a symbol of their authority. However, the Maori saw it as a threat to their sovereignty. Led by chiefs like Hone Heke, Maori warriors launched a series of attacks to bring down the flagstaff, symbolizing their resistance against British colonization. What makes this war similar to Finland's historical resilience is the Maori's tactical tenacity. They used guerrilla tactics and most importantly, Pas, which are these forts with intricate trenches which had anti-artillery bunkers, which arguably was the first of its kind. Now, oddly enough, similar to the War of 1812, the Flagstaff War's outcome didn't necessarily end in a victory for either side, although later down the line, the British ended up gaining this territory anyway. But hey, Finland also gave up a large portion of their territory to the Soviet Union after the Winter War too. So if anything, that fact solidifies that this is a tick for Box 2 for the Finland of Oceania. And for Box 3, I'd absolutely say this is a tick. Now, as many of you may be aware, New Zealand is within the Polynesian Triangle, as well as being the largest Polynesian country by land area. So one may imagine that since it's the largest, this is where the Polynesians began their voyage and then sent off into the smaller islands further east in the ocean. But amazingly, New Zealand was actually their final destination. And even more remarkable is how recent this voyage was, with the Maori people arriving in New Zealand in the 13th century at the very earliest estimation. This is absolutely crazy to think of how long New Zealand was uninhabited by humans for, especially considering that it's 100k miles squared. So not only is New Zealand unique to Polynesia, but also the entire world, as New Zealand represents mankind's last voyage, except Antarctica of course. And with that being said, this tick is a no-brainer, and on to the next entry. Asia, Japan. Japan, I'd say, is a relatively stable democracy with all things considered, and it's still a tick in my eyes, but there's also a lot of reason to challenge this notion. As an example could be, the fact that Shinzo Abe was literally assassinated via gunshots a few years back. However, that came as a shock to many, and Japan has incredibly strict gun laws, so any violent crimes with guns is nearly unheard of in Japan. And the reason that even happened was because of the government's connection with the Mooney Church, which is a whole other can of worms. But yeah, just understand that Japan is still a first world country with an electoral democracy despite its aforementioned flaws. I'm aware that nearly teetered into incoherent rambling, so let's move on to Box 2. Now, Japan has had countless examples of fending off major powers, including the Mongolians, Qing Dynasty China in the First Sino-Japanese War, and Tsarist Russia. All three of these showcase Japan's ability to fight against powers that are seemingly at better odds to win. What you could also say contributes to this box is the Sakoku period, where Japan closed off its borders from any outside influence, even during the twilight age of exploration and the golden age of overseas colonialism, which is arguably just as impressive as fending off the former powers they fought, which contributed to Japan's unique identity, which transitions nicely into Box 3. This is a tick in every measurable way. As much as I want to talk about how unique Japan's culture is, I've been more focusing on a linguistic and anthropological aspect to Box 3, and I intend to do the same for Japan as well. So with that being said, let me talk about the Japonic language family. Despite its close proximity to mainland Asia, Japanese does not have any proven connections that we know of to any major language of the region. And another interesting aspect to Japanese is, as a written language, it's well known that the character's origins come from Chinese, although the way these languages are read is entirely different. Chinese is a tonal language, whereas Japanese is a pitch-based language. And with any island, there's bound to be some genetic differences as well, as Japan is one of the few East Asian nations belonging to haplogroup D, specifically in the north, whereas the vast majority of East Asians belong to haplogroup O. And alright, I think you get the point. Japan is unique from most of Asia, blah blah blah. Let's move on to the final continent. Africa, NA. Alright, here's the problem I ran into with Africa. And that is, I can't honestly say that an African country ticks all three of the boxes, as the situation becomes clear because sometimes I'll find countries that can easily tick Box 1, but then cannot tick Box 2. And then there are some countries who can tick Box 2, but cannot tick Box 1. If you can think of an African country that does tick all three boxes, I fully invite you to tell me in the comments. I was maybe thinking Botswana, but I didn't want to go with that because you can't really say that they fended off a major power, not in the same way that Finland did. And I was also maybe considering Ethiopia, but I think we all know that it cannot tick Box 1. We've covered all the continents. It's time to rank the countries. And unsurprisingly, Africa's entry is at the bottom because there is none. I'd have to say that Japan is the third most accurate, and then New Zealand in second place, and then Canada, I believe, is the best like-for-like comparison, with the likes of the demographic, the fact that it's in the Arctic Circle, even its interest in hockey. There's a lot of similarities between Finland and Canada that I think cannot be ignored, and that's why I think it belongs in the top spot. So that's the end of the video. Thanks for watching, and be sure to join the Discord so you can vote on the next country that I cover.